In this video, I am going to walk you through the digital approximations of my watercolor palette, my real-life analog pigment watercolor palette. And more importantly, I'm going to show you how the principles of pigment watercoloring have flowed through into digital painting here, and how it lets me create beautiful, vibrant colors. Because of course, it doesn't matter one iota to you what I have in my pigment watercolor palette. What matters is the colors that you have access to here and what you can do with Procreate as a result of having these techniques at your fingertips. And initially, of course, I had no idea that I was kind of recreating my watercolor palette throughout my other palettes. As I started preparing for the Fast Color in Procreate course, I realized I had, as I went through, here was the cobalt blue within another palette. Here was the lemon yellow within a different palette. Here was the viridian within a different palette. I had yellow ochre, obviously I was kind of aware of that within my skin tones, chinos and general palette. I had the alizarin crimson. Well, I had this maroon color which I was using in my general palette, but I'd brought in a much more beautiful and closer to alizarin crimson into my own site palette. And the French ultramarine I've been using for ages within creating jeans and those kind of colors. And the burnt umber also was within my general palette. And it was quite an interesting realization because it made me delve back into how I use these, how I started using them, and that helped me to reverse engineer the techniques that I show in the Fast Color for Procreate course. So let's just dive in and have a look at how I use these specifically around things like skin tones and vegetation, just as an initial introduction. And of course, those three important principles that I mention, the first one is using low opacities so that I can build up but still have the different colors showing through each other. So the colors build on each other and create a composite color, which is very much something that happens in pigment watercolors. The second thing is, again, using that translucence. The white of this digital palette shows through, and in normal watercolor, the white of the paper shows through. And then the final thing is using many colors to create one color. And that might not make sense to you initially, but the reality is when you look out at a color in the real world, it may look like the green of a tree, but when you really look at it, it is multiple greens, and there'll be some yellow in there, and there'll be some reflected browns and reds and all sorts of colors. And that is what beautiful pigment watercolor does, is it takes many colors and works them together. And this approach that I will show you in my Procreate color course does the same thing. So let's dive in and have a look. We'll start off doing a skin tone, and I always start my skin tones with yellow ochre. Take it all the way down to 10%. So I'm using my my custom watercolor round brush. I've got it set to maximum opacity, and I just tap and swirl like this to build up a base kind of color glow at the very bottom. And then what I use my skin tones, chinos and general color, and I use this one here because that allows me to still work at 10%, and I can build up like this. And then I might go in and use this sort of bricky red if I want to put in a very red cheek, say. So that is how I build up the blush of a skin tone. And you can see my skin tone is pretty fair, so that works for me. If you look here at my skin tones palette, you can see I've got a whole range. So if you've got more olive tone skin, right through into the very deep brown skin, you can pick up colors here and work in a similar way. But I always start with this yellow ochre to give an underglow so that there's a vibrance and just a life that flows through or shines through the skin. And this principle comes from the watercoloring, where when I want to do my skin tone watercolor, I start with this yellow ochre like that, and then I mix on the palette the alizarin crimson into it. And you can see that if I put one on top of the other like that, I come with an approximate sort of fair pinkish skin tone. And so that was how I started fiddling around in digital watercolor. Then let's take a look at how we can do some vegetation. So switch off that layer, And if we pick up with vegetation, they're often yellows glowing through. And again, I would start with an undertone of yellow. You can start with a yellow ochre, which is a fairly muted yellow. So the undertone of the bush, say I'm doing a green bush like this, I could put in some yellow ochre. I'd probably put some of this lemon yellow as well, which is just a brighter, sunnier color for the tips. And then I can go in with my Viridian, and again I can tap and swirl like this to build up my bushes. So here I am tapping, swirling, and you can see where it overlaps. I get deeper greens where it doesn't overlap, more faded grayish greens. And then I can go in with this French ultramarine, which is perfect for adding in shadows. And wherever the deepest colors are, I can go in and add in a little bit more depth, a little bit of deeper shading. And I start to build up the sense of a bush which has got deep color depths within it and lighter depths on top. And of course, this is it's not a precise process, so you build up and see how it looks as you go. You can come back and add different color and then a few bursts of yellow over the top to give it a bit of life. And you start to build up a green bushiness like this with shadow and light within it. And so again, just a recap of those three principles, using very pale opacity. So here I'm using 10%, sometimes I go up to 20%. Letting the white of the digital canvas shine through both the colors, and the colors shine through each other, so the opacity allows the different colors to show through. And then the final thing is using many colors. So you can see here I've used the yellow ochre, I've used the lemon yellow, I've used the Viridian, and I've used some French ultramarine to build up this kind of bushy look in a very rough and ready bit of vegetation. And so that is the digital approximation of my pigment watercolor palette.